Okay, Professor Barry here. This is week number 4. We are off to the races in examining deviance this week. So the first 3 weeks of the term, kind of go through social theory, kind of sociological perspective, bringing in things such as thinking about self-determination, or self-determinism, individuals within environment, trying to understand that interplay between the two, examining kind of social influences, social groups, thinking about different studies in Zimbardo's study, Milgram, all those sort of like the Ash's, the line study, conformity. So all the way from like theory to to socialization to social groups. And now we're kind of starting to move into very specific areas to examine. And then we start with our journey here with sociology of deviance. So let's, and then we'll move into gender socialization, gender inequality, examine race, social class, global stratification. So we just start moving down a pathway where we kind of get into these kind of more narrow areas and take our tools, theories, ideas, and apply them to those different areas. See the title of the slide here, what is deviance? There's a lot more than meets the eye. And I say that because, deviance is this, I guess, raises the question, why study deviance? Like, what's the value in studying deviance? And one way to kind of approach it or think about it is to go back to the rise and development for really the expansion of sociology as an academic discipline with Durkheim in the 1800s. As we mentioned before, mass urbanization, industrialization, the formation of a lot of cities, people moving from rural communities into urban areas, a lot of social problems are developing. And there became within, sociology, this sort of examination of things that were going on in the environment, in the social context, and trying to understand the rise of criminal behavior, trying to understand criminality in order to address kind of, the underlying causes or influences of crime to create a more stable, stable communities. So there's a long history of evaluating and looking at deviance or looking at criminality in order to sort of promote this sort of more stable social systems. And then there's also a whole body of examining deviance that gets us into constructionism, sort of the way that we think about deviance, and we'll kind of get into that today a little bit, about labeling theory, the ideas we have about deviance, the cultural social influences on deviance, the power of labels themselves. So we can kind of get these different branches of theory in thinking about deviance. And one thing I like to approach, we have a class called Soc 211, Sociology of Deviance. It's a really fun class to teach, and it's enjoyable to be in that space and talking about deviance and working with students around sort of exploring what is deviance, how do we think about deviance. In large part, we study deviance to study society itself. Deviance is an expression of a lot of things that are going on in society. Oftentimes, move away from that individual level analysis, and then we can kind of look at either the demographics of individuals who are identified as being deviant or criminal, and then we kind of get into all kinds of social forces that are going on, and that'll be clear through our presentation here that it's that examining this area is really an examination of culture and society and social groups and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so let's kind of move on. I just want to give you a little bit of background there. If we kind of pull forward a little bit, these ideas like, Ash's study of conformity or Zimbardo's study, we can kind of mention here in a second again, is that this idea of conformity, right? And let's kind of link it back up to empathy and self-determinism. So that idea of, that humans have a tendency to conform to the group. It's a fundamental human characteristic. It's an animal characteristic. And to help us have empathy and understanding for why individuals may become involved in social groups that may be damaging to oneself or to one other. There's aspects of conformity that are going on within that. And it kind of brings our attention to this sort of that idea of self-determination as well, right? So that we're thinking about the individual in context, and we're thinking about both the headwinds and tailwinds, the things that are coming at people that are like, preventing them from moving in different directions, and the things that are coming behind them and kind of moving them in a different direction. So it's being conscious and being more aware what are those things that are going on that are shaping the human experience. And we can think about, this was a chart or a slide from last week, thinking about sexual assault on college campuses within fraternities. There's that conformity piece going on there. The Tulsa race riot of 1921, there's more public attention and recognition for that race riot that happened in 1921. I know the labeling, and it's a lot of things that are going on there that are all about that sort of social group process. Of course, other things that are going on as well, but we paint in this case, looking at and examining that sort of piece of that social pressure or social group influence. And as mentioned before, things like the Stanford prison experiment, Milgram's experiment, there's a lot of flaws in the research design and then how it was reported. And, there's a lot of complications with the research itself, but it's not that there's no value in the research, but it's how we've interpreted, or it's the misrepresentation of some of that research. It's how we've interpreted that research, where we've led us to sort of this idea that humans are these kind of really vile creatures when left to their own devices. And the stories like the Lord of the Flies, kind of reinforce this idea that when left without any social control or social structure around us, that it's basically every person for themselves, and that people do harm others to gain advantage. And that's a story we tell, but it's not necessarily an accurate story. Encourage you to read this. It's kind of an interesting story of this is Lord of the Flies, which was written by an English author in I want to say probably 1960s. It could be wrong about that. And then there's that sort of gruesome kids left alone on an island and sort of what happens. But then there's the real life story of these kids who were left, basically got shipwrecked. They left school one day, I think from New Zealand, got on a boat, thought to take a little trip, and got lost, got a baby, and they got wrecked on an island, and they were left there for 15 months. And it's through cooperation that they were able to survive. It's their sort of story. And this book, Bregman, does a great job of kind of looking at all kinds of stuff about the cooperation and the others, this humankind, a hopeful history. We can also, and we're going to bring this into our discussion too, thinking about Weber and McDonaldization. And it's kind of strange to maybe think about this, but think about our prisons, the modern day, development of the penitentiary, and then after the penitentiary, developing this sort of new models of the prison system. This is called a panopticon. So one of the first architectural models of the prison is this idea of having a guard in a central guard tower who can see all, or he or she, but this case, in this time period, he could see all the way around. And it's just like less people to control more people. Efficiency was kind of what was, designed in the architecture. So it's this increasingly rationalization within our social systems, and it comes through in our architecture, and it comes through in things such as, okay, we can do more and more with new technologies. We can have more and more, gather more information about people. We can engage in social control in new and different ways, and we can expand the net of control. And through things like the anklet is one, anklet monitoring system provides an example of that idea of McDonaldization or of increased rationalization. In some ways, leads us to this sort of idea that the world becomes more and more disenchanted. Those places that were basically very spiritual in nature, now we have a different, it's just like our different value set within at a global level in high income countries. The world has just moved to this increasingly rational kind of place. Doesn't make it worse, just makes it different. Okay, so let's go through these themes. There's going to be, as we kind of get a little bit later on, I'll kind of explain a little bit about, once we get to the theories, kind of how to approach the theories. So first of all, let's just define deviance. Deviance is a violation of a social, I should have finished that first before I took that sip. Violation of a social norm. So norm is an expectation for behavior, and deviance is a violation of that norm. But that may be the definition, but man, that's just going to get us started, because then it leads us to all kinds of different things. What is the norm? How did the norm get established? Does everybody who violate the norm get the same response? What is the response? how is the response determined? I mean, these are all these different kind of things that start to come up, right? So we can define it. It's helpful to some degree, but then it leads to all kinds of different questions. And, you know, I guess it's important to think about, I think as well, that we start to separate out this idea that something that is deviant or something that's criminal is actually by bad, and that all things are bad are actually deviant or criminal. And to start to move away from that oversimplifying of a complex social issue. And I'll give you this example here in the case of Oregon versus Rideout, 1978. It was the first landmark court case where within a marital relationship, somebody was charged, a husband was charged with sexually assaulting his wife. So before 1978, I mean, it was basically no criminal sanctions against a husband having, you know, sexually assaulting his wife. I mean, it's pretty powerful, right? That's 45 years ago, that it wasn't a criminal sanction. So it raises the question, right? It starts to raise this question, like what's being defined as being criminal in this case? How are things being defined? That's a reflection of culture. So you can kind of get into this space now. You start thinking about, we're studying this stuff so we can understand gender inequality in this case. We can understand patriarchy in this case. We can start to look at these kind of factors. Look at Martin Luther King, you know, that we, you know, of course, recognize and celebrate him today for helping move the needle on democracy in the United States, to addressing race relations in the United States. But at the time period, you know, when he was, you know, involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, social movement, social organization, civil rights movement, that wasn't uniform agreement for sure. And in certain areas of the country, I mean, he's viewed as a communist and viewed with a lot of disdain. So different interpretations of the same, you know, somebody that we celebrate today to recognize, you know, because another example of deviance, there's subjective elements involved in it. There's a lot of social power in terms of being able to define what is deviant. There's a lot of stuff going on there. I put here, you know, for sociology, the focus is not on the individual, but patterns, like getting the general and the particular. So not interested in and actually opposed to these claims of these sort of bad individuals. And that becomes tricky sometimes, because look at mass shooters, for example, looking at the patterns. What are the underlying demographics of the individuals who engage in mass shooting? Not interested in individual like pathology or an individual explanation, but rather looking at things that are more external to the self and looking for patterns of behavior. We're often prone to this idea of its bad individual claims. And that fits our idea, that sort of individualist kind of perspective and rugged individualism. It's kind of why we go to places like, oh, they must have a mass shooter must have a mental illness. And we kind of use that as an explanation, which is, I think, a pretty misguided and also pretty harmful sort of approach, sort of thinking about this is, you know, the result of mass shooting, or that mass shooting is a result of mental illness. It's a very limited perspective, and it doesn't get us to understanding more completely, it doesn't move us towards understanding those social forces, factors that may be shaping and influencing. Perhaps, you know, we're conditioned to divide us and them, you know, sort of moral positions, and have difficulty understanding that expressions of deviant or criminal behavior are always about that interaction between individuals and social forces and the non-deviant. And I think sometimes it's actually more about the non-deviant than it is about the individual or individuals who are being identified as deviant or criminal. So, for example, like looking at homelessness is a huge social issue, social problem here in Central Oregon as well. Sometimes, you know, the response to the homelessness, I mean, who knows what the right policy is? I mean, we're not going to try to debate kind of right policy, but sometimes the way in which the stigmatization of the homeless is really more about the individuals who are not homeless than it is about the homeless themselves. So that becomes it's something to kind of like, I guess, look at and examine. So let's kind of think about sociology of deviance. We're gonna have these two different areas. We have deviance and we have crime. They're like these two, like Venn diagram, right? Two circles that are overlapping, like that. And it could be sometimes that deviance and crime are fully separate. What is deviant may not be criminal, and what is criminal may not be deviant. So maybe deviant to have, if I have full-on facial tattoo, but it's not against the law. Something could be against the law. It could be a criminal act, such as excessive speeding, let's say 80 miles an hour between two different cities or communities here in Central Oregon, with a posted speed limit is 55 or 60. That's a violation, it's a criminal offense, but it's not viewed as maybe being deviant. So we're trying to separate out, deviance and crime. Sometimes they do overlap, but sometimes not. So it's kind of separating out both those factors. And then in criminality, we kind of separate out, we're dealing with examining criminality. We're often just like the body of criminology, the study of crime. It's much more focused on what we call positivism, sort of empirical evidence. What are the general patterns? What are the underlying features and factors that are causing or shaping or influencing crime patterns? So that's more of a positivist perspective. And then deviance, which would be, such things as body modification, doing things that are that sort of violation, understanding, Colin Kaepernick taking a knee at a football game in protest in support of Black Lives Matter. That's deviance, not criminal. That deviance is much more open to sort of examination through the sort of lens of constructionism. So we have these two different kind of approaches and two different ways of thinking, and they're applied differently to crime and to deviance. And we're going to go through here in a second. We're going to move into the next theme. We're going to deal with these 4 elements. We'll kind of explore those further. Another thing to kind of consider too is that it could be, try to separate out the degree of harm and the objective level of harm. So something could be really harmful, right? Smoking cigarettes, really harmful. It was harmful in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. It wasn't until 1970s, actually, the Surgeon General started having the warning sign on a pack of cigarettes. And then they're basically in the 1980s, I think it was the 1980s, maybe the early 1990s, when the Senate hearing and committee hearings with the tobacco companies executives came before the Senate and basically being asked a lot of questions about the addictive properties of tobacco. And the executives kind of like had this organized effort to say nicotine is not addictive. And that became like, that was it. I think the public and the Congress lost faith and trust in the tobacco industry and came down on them, new regulations and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, to say that tobacco, a lot of objective level harm, but not perceived, right? So not perceived as being harmful until a certain time period. So we're trying to separate out, it could be all these different factors. You don't need to write these down or know them, but just trying to separate out this idea that objective level harm could go up, and at the same time, responses may go up. So something could be harmful, and then we respond accordingly. Could be that the objective level of harm goes up, but there's no change. Like things are actually becoming worse and worse, or are more threatening to people, but there's no response. And you can kind of go down all these different ways. It's just separating out in our minds, there doesn't have to be a relationship between objective level of harm and subjective level of understanding about that particular thing, but they're separate from one another. Okay, so let's kind of move into theme number 2, which are these 4 elements of deviance, that kind of a way that we can approach thinking about deviance and provide a more holistic perspective in thinking about deviance. The first thing is we can focus on the act, and I probably should put here, it's the act or the condition a person has, or a belief, the way that they think. So sometimes, somebody holds on to beliefs that are counter to the dominant culture or to culture itself. And that belief is a violation of the social norm. So it could be more than just the act, it could be act, behavior, or a condition. But it's that first element. It's about addressing meanings and understanding what is the assignment of meaning. And to get to there, we have to get into historical, cultural, and social factors that shape the meaning. So the question here is taking the life of another person, is that deviant or criminal? Well, the answer would be, well, it depends. Depends on the time and place, depends on the individual, so that act, the assigning a meaning of it, is very contextual. The image you see here is an image of a lynching in the South. You can see it's a public event. People sold body parts after lynchings, postcards were sold. So that during that time period, and it was African Americans, Italian Americans, predominantly African Americans, but there are others who are lynched as well, predominantly in the South, but all the way up into, I believe, like, Michigan. Yeah, you could, all the way up north. I mean, just go along. This wasn't just a lynchings were not only in the South. So the act, right? So trying to understand the act, and not all deviance is voluntary. So kind of think about that as well. It could be that individuals or, somebody's born with a physical deformity, they have a condition, maybe viewed as being deviant, but it's not voluntary. This is all about thinking about the act, behavior, or the condition. So labeling something, increasing tobacco, access to tobacco at the age of 21, just like trying to understand, where did that law come from? Why now? Kind of try to think about the act itself. Smoking, aerosoling, vaporizing motor vehicles when a child is present. It was 2018, I want to say, in the state of Oregon. It's like how it's kind of interesting, it's, making it a misdemeanor, but a sanction for aerosoling, vaporizing while there's somebody in the car under the age of 18. Law enforcement don't pull people over for it, but an individual could have have a fine for that. And it starts to raise a lot of questions about who's behind the establishment of these laws, why these laws, why is that a violation? Is that really about the objective level of harm? I mean, these, become something that we can kind of examine and look at. All right, so we can kind of move on to, we got the act, then we can kind of move into the actor. When we go to the actor, we start to examine things like a person's social position or individual social position and how that might shape the subjective understanding of the act and the responses to that, right? So you just got some different images here. This is supposed to be sort of an image on sort of a college campus and binge drinking. And, does the actor make a difference? Somewhat funny, I kind of say, if there's somebody goes to a retirement community and there's a group of 70-year-olds who are beer bonging, do we interpret it through the same lens? What about if the person was by themselves? I mean, that would be a whole different interpretation, right? This is kind of the expectation, this is in a social environment, particular age. What about racial demographic? What about other demographics? Do we have the same filter in terms of our interpretation of that? January 6th event, insurrection, the protest or the hostile takeover of the Capitol building. Does the actor make a difference? If those were people of color who were engaged in, taking over the Capitol, would there be the same response from larger society itself? Think about, people show up to school board meetings and protest for the mask mandate in different states. And I just started to wonder about the degree of influence of the racial position of those actors. To what degree does race matter? If it was a policy that was being handed down by the state and communities of color were reacting and responding to that and opposed to a mandate, whatever it may have been or something, and showed up to board meetings and engaged in similar behavior, would that go the same way? Would the outcome be the same? Would the interpretation be the same? So we're looking at the actor, right? And the interpretation of the status position of the actor on understanding of that behavior and responses to it. I think an interesting example is women who, just like the norm and expectation for cussing. There's males have more privilege or there's less sanctioning for males to use the F-bomb, right? And when women are swearing, there's sort of this double standards that are going on there. Kind of give you another example, Brock Turner. That's kind of getting dated now. When was Brock Turner? So Stanford University student, and basically a sexual case of sexual assault. That was 2016. She was unconscious, and the way he worked through the criminal justice system, I think people were astonished and alarmed, in some ways maybe not surprised, that his social position in terms of his class position led to or influenced an outcome that people felt that most people felt was not just, that he was let off too easily for what he did. So the actor. So still on theme 2, now we kind of get into this setting, and that norms and expectations are dependent upon the context. So here's a couple different examples. Public displays of affection, it's like, okay, well, it could engage in the same behavior in a different place, but it's the violation of the setting. Person arrested for smoking a joint in Tennessee court, yeah, not a good idea. And then put it here, like Oregon voters legalized therapeutic psilocybin. So the first state in the nation to legalize psilocybin for therapeutic treatment. So the setting is within a clinical setting under the supervision of a clinical clinician. Outside of that setting, it is a criminal act. So setting is kind of an important. And then finally is audience response. So an audience response is needed for something to be deviant. So response is like a social control measure, all the way from the micro level, informal responses from individuals, all the way to the macro level, institution structures and society itself. So informal to formal, audience response is required for deviance to exist. There has to be some process of some stigma involved for deviance to exist. If there's no audience there to observe something happens, there's no deviance, right? So we call it secret deviance, where there's no identification of the individual or individuals who violated anything. It's like there's no audience. There has to be an audience present for deviance to exist. Smoking, these are just different examples of smoking in different country where it's acceptable. Airports today, going back to actually smoking on the plane, it's the audience level of assigning meaning, and the audience assigns meaning. They're shaped by culture and influenced by culture. So we paying attention to that audience response. Okay, now we're gonna get into the theories. Theories are basically their perspectives, right? That are grounded in research. So we have all these different theories, just like you go take a social psych class or developmental psych class, you have all these different theories of human behavior and human development. Some of them, there's limitations and values and benefits for each theory, different levels of support. Sometimes it's like it's what area of life or issue is it being applied to? Maybe there's more valid connection to some issues versus others. And that's why there's no right or wrong theory, but some theories provide more of a valid understanding of a social issue or a social situation. If we look at the homeless, for example, we could look at that from a lot of different theoretical viewpoints, but some theories have a stronger case to make, more well supported by research than others. Some theories they're not designed to address particular human behavior or human conditions. Other theories are. So it's kind of a little bit tricky, but just to say that we got all these theories, they don't all apply to the same kind of thing. Some of them are more applicable to certain things than others. But the value in these is that it gives us more tools through which we can view the world, more lenses through which we can view the world and try to understand what's going on in the world around us. So we're going to cover 7 of them, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. And rather than the normal 75 to 125 words for each theory, you can list out the key ideas. So just bullet point, boom, 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 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, key ideas of each theory, and still list each theory as a separate theme. But rather than writing out a paragraph, you can still do that if you want. You can just list out the characteristics, would be more than fine. Okay, the first theory that we're going to get into, and maybe in class we'll start with the biological perspective because that's kind of an interesting, it's kind of like the first main theory of criminology. We could kind of go there, but the first one here is social disorganization theory or social ecology, human ecology theory. And the idea here, this is our first main, I'm going to say it first, probably the second main theory of sociological, a theory on crime. And specifically it's on crime, it's not on deviance, right? Going back to that idea about positivism and, focus on criminality. And this is a theory of trying to understand crime. And in a nutshell, the idea is that the more stable a community is, the more there's a sense of community, that people like live in the community. People that buy homes, the home ownership is really high. Employment rates are relatively high. There's a lot of civic organizations for people to participate in and have a sense of belonging and sense of responsibility to their neighbor. Like all that kind of stuff facilitates lower crime rates. It's in communities where there's a lot of disorganization, a lot of unemployment. People are in and out. People move. There's not a lot of home ownership. Not a lot of organizations that are engaging people in development of community. Like these are the kind of things that start to develop zones where crime is more likely to happen. And one, we could look at post-industrialism, which is starting in the 1970s. It's like, get industrialization, you go back to the 1800s all the way till 1960s, 70s, when we go to post-industrial. And places like Detroit, Baltimore, Maryland, other major cities around the United States that lost a lot of jobs, manufacturing jobs left. People who had resources to leave, a lot of them left, created a lot of instability in community, rising crime rates as a result. Anomie's normlessness, a lot of rapid change in a short amount of time created a lot of dysfunction in these communities. So this brings a theory that really provides a lot of empathy, trying to provide a lot of empathy and understanding of individuals who are living in these communities versus the sort of the bad individual sort of thing. People still need to be responsible for their action, but it's moving towards a structural level understanding of things, like what's going on in these communities. Let's look at a more macro level, kind of social issues and processes. You can kind of like, look, this is just sort of, violent crime rate, murder, rape, robbery, assault. This is the violent crime rate. We can look at the national rate, look at Maryland overall, looking in Baltimore. This is a video. We're not going to be able to show it. But man, when Baltimore was a big steel producer, if you go back and historically you look at the rates of violent crime in Baltimore, it wasn't until deindustrialization where these problems became magnified, these underlying social issues. Crime existed in Baltimore for sure when the steel industry was there, but it's the level and the extent and it's the causes of crime different than what's going on today. And it's important to keep in mind too, is what this video kind of gets after this person here, is that Baltimore is more than just a city of kind of like, dire conditions. It's kind of the story that maybe we tell. There's people are, doing amazing things in Baltimore. So just kind of keeping that kind of in mind as well. I'm going to bring this to Central Oregon. And this is Bend, of course, the old mill district. There's an HBO series that came out, or a film that came out last year, 2020. And it's called Our Towns. If you get a chance to watch it, it's really powerful story. And basically the filmmakers wanted to tell the story about cities and towns that have reinvented themselves. So during a time period of a lot of change going on, where there was a strong economic sector in that community and those jobs left, profiling communities that have reinvented themselves. And the last town they profile in this film is Bend, Oregon. And to give you the contrast, think about, the mills, the vital part to the community, mill jobs leave. There's nothing there to replace that. You're going to create a lot of instability within the environment itself. So we said Central Oregon, Bend becomes a place for travel and tourism and different industries. And, it becomes a place for a lot of economic activity, which provides a lot of stability. This is a book written by Nicholas Kristof. He's from Oregon City, I think, maybe he's from Yamhill, but in that area, he grew up. The story is, he grows up in this community of Yamhill. There's manufacturing jobs, there's a mill in the town, and I think Yamhill's probably an hour and a half, maybe south of Portland. So when he was growing up, this was a vital community, strong solidarity. Every community has its issues, but they're relatively low in this community. The sense of integration, belonging, connection started to happen with deindustrialization. People who could leave left. The manufacturing centers closed down, unemployment. So he goes back He goes back as an adult. He's probably in his, I don't know, I'm going to say he's in his 40s, 50s. He goes back and he sees the level of poverty, level of crime, level of just sort of desperation. It's a community of a lot of desperation in that community. And it's this, Americans still struggling for hope is sort of they're walking on this tightrope. I mean, it's a different world in that community than it was before. And that becomes just sort of a great example of social disorganization theory. Okay, so then we move into labeling theory. And labeling theory is the idea that nothing is deviant or criminal until it's labeled as deviant or criminal. So this is an ordinance that goes back to during the time period of the war on drugs. It was after the start of war on drugs with certain cities, you start to get into mass incarceration. And then you get sort of this like prison posturing, a lot of dramaturgy. You could look at it from a dramaturgy sort of viewpoint. And, baggy pants, this sort of like clothes and appearance, dress, and cities started to banning the wearing of certain clothes in certain ways in the community. And a lot of people interpreted that was very specifically directed towards certain racial groups, towards males as well. And now we're kind of going to the place of repealing it. This is 2020. Most places have repealed those kind of laws. So that wasn't deviant, right? Like wearing your pants out was not deviant until it was labeled that way. And once we get into labeling, we start to have to kind of examine and think about too that labels have different degrees of impact on one's identity or consequences to one's life, the level of stigma. Somebody who has more status, labels just are harder to stick, right? Somebody who's a celebrity and you go, man, what, you think about some of the antics and things that people who are high profile celebrities, behavior they may engage in may receive a significantly different sanction than the general public, and maybe less stigma. We forgive or we forget more easily than it is maybe for another group. And they kind of get us into like looking glass self, right, with Cooley, or thinking about the generalized other with Mead, or dramaturgy, you can kind of get into as well in thinking about this. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis starts to get us into the issue of language. So if they're labels, right, these are words that we're using, they're labeling something as being deviant. How is that being described in that language? And sort of, we can examine that language to examine, all kinds of stuff about culture, race, class, gender, other factors that are going on there. Labeling theory also, brings to our attention, if it's a label, it could be that label could be a master status. So labeling someone, for example, like a crack addict, someone with an addiction or drug dependence. Like even all of those are different words, right? A crack addict, a crackhead, different language, or think a person with a crack addiction, all different language. Some of them have more stigma, or contain more stigma than others. And it eventually could be a master status, right? A status that sticks out above all other status positions. So even though, somebody who, it becomes like the orientation point. So a person can have a complex identity, different parts of their self, but they have part of their self there's a person has a history with using crack cocaine or powder cocaine or some substance. That substance in that part of their identity for us, may stand out, may be a significant part for their own identity and the way that other people see them. Once we get into culture, labels, we also kind of oftentimes get into issues of, why is that being assigned a label? Are there class, race, gender, other issues going on that are shaping the assigning of that as being deviant? I think baggy pants ordinances probably kind of reach that in some way. And then we get this like Lemert societal reaction perspective, where you have primary deviance, which is the deviance before being defined as being deviant. So a person can engage in, let's say, a behavior for a long time, but never gets assigned or identified as being deviant. And then secondary deviance is after the assigning of deviance and the stigmatization of deviance, the consequences, okay, there could be a lot of different social, economic consequences for being identified as being deviant. So then we kind of look at secondary deviance. What are the impacts of the label itself? All right, so if that makes sense, you got primary before being labeled, secondary after being labeled, and now it's kind of the interest is, okay, so how do we separate out the motivations from the original engaging in a particular behavior before being labeled, the motivations, what was going on, the context around that, and then thinking about after being labeled, are there different motivations that are encouraging further deviant behavior or criminal behavior? And then there's tertiary deviance, which is maybe at some point individuals may bring that part of that stigmatized identity, bring it into themselves and actually have ownership over that, try and shift the narrative about that versus, I mean, stigma is a negative, is to actually embrace that part of someone's identity and their experience to turn to something into that act of resistance in a way to kind of embrace maybe that part of one's life experience. We don't, there's a lot of research on thinking about the degree of influence of labeling. It's not that, to really try to steer away from, and sometimes individuals will write this in their papers that, well, if a person's labeled as deviant, they'll be deviant. It's like, no, that's oversimplifying a complex issue. It has an influence. The question is to what degree, when, and how it has an influence. Like that's the investigation. It's not that there's no causal factor. A person is not labeled, is labeled as deviant, doesn't become deviant. It's degrees of influence and how people manage that stigma becomes the issue. Brian Stevenson, who's done a lot of work throughout his life and working with issues of racial injustice within the criminal justice system, specifically people on death row. And he talks about in a lot of his talks about this issue of labeling. He doesn't talk about the theory, of course, and he's not using the language of the theory, but he says, that when he meets and interacts with people that are working through the criminal justice system, they can take on the identity that they become no more than a criminal, or they become no more than the act that they are either did or are accused of doing. And definitely this sort of master status, right? So a person and he says, that it doesn't matter who you are. If you did something, you're more than just that act. So for example, if you embezzled money, you're more than an embezzler. If you stole money, you're more than a thief. If you committed murder, you're more than a murderer. And you see what he's kind of going after, like these labels, and these labels have incredible stigma and power, and it becomes a master status. And is to be aware of that, and to aware that we have these complex parts of who we are, and to pay respect and honor to those complex parts of who we are. So labeling theory, kind of another example. This is Stonewall in 1969, the start of the modern day gay rights movement, challenging legal codes regarding same-sex relations, particularly between males. It's like changing the labels, the assigning of meaning. And you can go all the way to, the Supreme Court in the United States in 2015, finally recognizing same-sex relations as being constitutional. Brigham Young graduate gave a speech a few years ago, and him identifying himself as gay, communicating in his commencement speech. I mean, a major transformation and shifting and thinking about how we think about as a country and as a place, how we think about same-sex relations. This is just a couple charts about people's perceptions about same-sex relations, and it's a major public shift in views. We can kind of get into labeling, get into this like label of the super predator. If we go back to superior wharf hypothesis, like this language arises in the 1980s, 1990s, super predator basically born to be evil, right? And it's like this super predator. And this was a narrative, a story that was being told in a certain time period. Politicians were using it both on the left and the right. This is very American. I mean, there wouldn't be other countries. I would gather no other country use this language of like these super predator kind of thing. So, and the power of language, right? We start to view youth, and this is directed at youth in the inner city and predominantly focused on, the youth of color in the inner city. And it's a sort of lens, like these are super predators, kids who engage in criminal behavior, involved in gangs, and sort of the consequences of that. So there's a lot of, the influence of that on social policy, the influence of that on, the stigma towards individuals. I mean, there's so much stuff going on there with labeling within that. I provide this chart here, looking at suicide rates. This is from Center Suicide Prevention. I think it's 2019 or 20. I couldn't find the exact date of the publication. It was an online resource, and they cited research through 2018. So I just assumed it was 2019, 20. But to me, it's a good example of societal reaction perspective. So think about the rate of suicide for individuals who are transgender are significantly higher than the general population. And that, I think a significant level of that has to do with societal reaction, the way that society stigmatizes and exclude the exclusionary aspects from dominant culture and society. It's not about being transgender that's causing the rates to be higher. It's that stigma and the consequences of that stigma. And so that gives you a good example, I think, in terms of labeling theory and the power of labels to shape identity and experience. Related to labeling theory is this idea of medicalization of deviance. And now we're going to get into medicalization. It's the identification of deviance by experts, whether medical experts or psychiatrists or the field of, whatever the institution is, but experts identifying things as being deviant. So who has a vested interest in medicalization? Could be the field of psychiatry. Could be even other institutions like criminal justice system, education, because it becomes a way that we can explain behavior that may be benefiting those institutions. Could be pharmaceutical companies are advancing particular ideas about particular things, or maybe even the general public, is like medicalizing everyday life conditions and stuff like that, because it fits our cultural values and ideals. And this idea of medicalization, deviance is tied to like an individual level, biological, psychiatric, individual sort of pathology. And in the 1970s, some of you, there became this movement called the anti-psychiatry movement, this response within academia and in other circles of reacting to some of the more blatant and horrific consequences of institutionalization of people with mental illness, state hospitals, and what was going on with ECT treatment, lobotomies, removal of the frontal lobe of the brain, and just sort of all these different kind of things that are going on to the public. The public became more aware, and there became a response and reaction to the field of psychiatry, and it's called the anti-psychiatry movement. So if some of you may know Ken Kesey, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest from Eugene, Oregon. And that book, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, means part of the anti-psychiatry movement going on in the 1970s. I'll provide a couple different examples. This is kind of, I don't know, I just thought it was kind of interesting. It maybe not be fully related, but it's this idea that people are looking for kind of like biological underpinnings or psychiatric underpinnings for why people do what they do. So this medicalizing or biologically essentializing kind of behavior. And I thought it was just kind of funny, this, looking at the human skull, it's called craniometry, looking at the human skull and trying to understand what are the underlying conditions underneath that, that the skull is a reflection of what's going on with one's brain, right? So if you look at these skulls, like we can distinguish between the genuine husband, the unreliable husband, the positively honest husband. Anyone with a head like this will be positively selfish, tricking, deceitful, sort of like the biologically essentializing kind of things going on. If you go back to early, this is like early psychiatry early psychiatry. This is in the 1700s, I believe. Benjamin Rush, these different ways people are, the field of psychiatry is not really, it's growing and developing, trying to figure out what's causing people to have, psychotic symptoms, to be able to hear things that aren't actually there, or hear or see things that aren't actually there. So how to explain it, how to treat it. And these become some of the early treatment mechanisms. In an article, I just thought it was a really interesting interview with this professor of psychiatry and human ecology, Riason. So I think, many have promised. There's been a lot of work with compassion meditation. Emory University has one of the most interesting Tibetan Buddhist programs in the US. Evidence of fasting, which is widely practiced in spiritual traditions, has an antidepressive effect. So if you deprive yourself of food, it sponsors elated states of mind. And this might be why some people who get depressed don't eat. It's an attempt at self-treatment. Hypothermia, overheating the body, is also a powerful antidepressant. The use of heat, spiritual purposes, and healing Sweat lodges, for example, is widespread, especially in indigenous societies. Now, it's really interesting, that we start to think about things like with depression and think about, with the appetite suppression as an indication of depression, of a pathology. And what Raisin is sort of identifying here is that that's a body response, a natural body response, a way of adjusting, a way of addressing underlying conditions. So rather than seeing it as a pathology, it's moving to think about it. It's a normative response. I don't want to go too far into this, but you can kind of get into the rise of institutions to address mental illness in our societies, the building of the asylum. This is Oregon. This is Oregon State Insane Asylum. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. I mean, this is Salem, Oregon. Kesey, not too far from there. There's a mass, this is the time period where inpatient treatment for people with mental illness and some of the things like ECT treatments and lobotomies were going on. Then kind of get into like medicalization. Here become some examples, like this idea of gender dysphoria, the gender identity disorders. And it seems obvious from standing out that these ideas that we're trying to identify, that the field of psychiatry, that some people, psychological distress resulting from incongruences between one's sex assigned at birth and one's gender identity. Gender dysphoria often begins in childhood. Some people may experience it later in life. So it's pathologizing something. Another way to shift our mind and thinking about it, is it the sick individual or is it the sick society? If there's things that are going on, there are complications in terms of one's gender identity, but the source is in the social world, like that societal reaction, stigma kind of thing. Well, then people may have a natural difficulty adjusting to an environment where they're being stigmatized. So why are we identifying it as a psychiatric disorder? I mean, there's a lot of power within that. The question of who's defining, who's shaping. This is why medicalization is related to labeling. It's who has ownership over the labels themselves. It wasn't until 1973 where homosexuality was identified as a diagnosable mental health disorder. Just sort of reflecting this idea that sometimes labels are reflecting dominant cultural ideals. We can think about this idea about PMDD, premenstrual dysphoric disorder. There's a lot of controversy around this particular disorder. The labeling of that women who experience significant mood changes during a particular time, premenstrual disorder, and it could have, just the level of intensity of their menstrual cycle, premenstrural cycle, and impact. But labeling it as a disorder, a lot of questions and controversy about that. And this kind of goes back. This is 1800s, Samuel Cartwright coming up with this idea that slaves who ran away from their slave owners, the only way to explain that is that they must be filled with mania. So it's a condition called drapetomania, this desire to run away, psychologizing, a particular behavior. So I don't know, just different examples. The question is, did these anti-psychiatrists go too far? You have some individuals like Thomas Saz who says, well, mental illness is a myth. And his argument is not that things like psychosis, that people don't experience that, or people don't have different varied states of mood or disposition or depression, anxiety. I mean, those are real physiological things. I mean, he would not deny that. What his idea is that those are neurological, physiological disorders, not psychiatric disorders. And then what he's kind of also argues or provides a perspective is that most stuff that gets treated by the field of psychiatry is actually problems in living, not underlying significant pathologies. It raises a lot of questions that are good for debate and discussion. And it seems like, we need to recognize that, man, our mental states are being shaped by our social environment. Sometimes identifying it as a mental health condition can be really helpful, because it can give us kind of some answers, it can give clinicians a perspective that can help them in terms of shaping treatment. There's a lot of value in that. So you wouldn't want to just dismiss all that evidence and all that work out of that field. At the same time, to not accept everything coming out of that field at the same time. And that's why, and then Johann Hari, this book, Lost Connections, for part of his life, He really identifies with the biological perspective, like why does he have depression and anxiety? And the story that was common in culture then and probably today still is that it's a serotonin level problem, that he doesn't have enough serotonin. So he starts to take medication to address his serotonin levels. And then he discovers, basically continues to investigate and eventually starts to interview researchers from around the world who are working in the area of depression and anxiety. And it's really interesting. These are, a lot of social scientists that he interviews that are doing a lot of work and understanding basically human behavior and the human experience. And he walks away from that and say that narrative and that story about serotonin levels is, it's not the complete story. And it's a lot of inaccuracies in that story, that he gets its lost connections. It's our feeling a sense of respect and value from our community, being integrated in our community, having work that's valuable, all these different kind of things that are going on that are really about the social environment context. And so I think one of the dangers of medicalizing and medicalizing all these different conditions is that it moves us away from looking at some of those other parts of our lives and our community in a way. I don't know. Finally, this sort of, you can look this over, these first two, but I just kind of point out here that he talks about this research. What I thought was really interesting. This is in that article from Sun Magazine. If you're interested, you could go check it out. Where's it at? Here we go. Here's the citation for it if you want to read it. But he says, that basically in anthropological work going to some indigenous communities in Bolivia, and in those communities, they didn't have the language of depression. He says, and damned if this group didn't have exactly the same symptoms that we do in the Western world. And he's saying there's depression is a natural response to things going on in the environment. So making them a pathology is pretty powerful. So moving away from biological determinism, these are kind of, like I mentioned, lost connections. Sebastian Junger's book is also another good one. Just want to let you know that we're on this topic, that we do have personal counseling services available free to students. It's like having a life coach. So it can be a really valuable, beneficial resource for you. And I want you to be aware that personal counseling services are available on campus. All right, theme number 6, we're getting into inequalities and addressing basically from the conflict theory perspective, that what's defined as a crime, and then thinking about the processing of individuals who get identified as being, identified as engaging in a criminal act, that throughout that whole process, there's issues of inequities that are going on, race, class, and gender, or potentially issues of race, class, and gender inequalities going on throughout all of that kind of stuff. What is the law? Sometimes the law protects particular interest. It's an expression of interest. Maybe it's intentionally designed that way, maybe not. But there's stuff going on, right? So it's an institution where there's a lot of social power. It's a social control institution. So we're going to get into all kinds of stuff with conflict theory about how systems are used in a way to reinforce particular power relations between different groups. The war on drugs, I think there's a lot of evidence, a lot of research on looking at the racial impacts or the influence of race on policies that were going on in the 1980s and 1990s that shaped the war on drugs. There's a film called 13th, which provides a nice historical kind of backdrop to thinking about the 13th Amendment. We start thinking about retribution versus rehabilitation. Are our systems, like punishment, designed for really rehabilitating people to bring them back out in the community, or is it about retribution? An eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Some of that may be related to our cultural values, but there's a lot of issues of power going on. And some policies that seem to make sense, this goes back like early in the term, the first week, I said, we got the empirical side of stuff, and then we have common sense, right? And sometimes like what we believe to be true may not actually be true. For a lot of, stop and frisk policies or broken windows, this idea that if there are broken windows in the community, if we can fix the broken windows, people can start taking care of the community, it'll create this sort of more solidarity in the community and crime rates will go down. Or stop and frisk for minor level things that are going on, or if you suspect things are going on, or create greater control, create greater stability in these communities. The reality is that these kind of things these policies were not empirically proven to be beneficial. In fact, stop and frisk was viewed as being unconstitutional, a violation of fundamental civil rights. And there's a lot, I mean, even in Broken Windows, there's a great podcast with the author, one of the authors of Broken Windows, who designed that policy. And he said, that their research behind Broken Windows got taken out of context, basically, and started making these social policies that were far from what they wrote about in terms of broken windows. So as the way that policy became interpreted by lawmakers and those in the legislature, and basically he disagreed with the policies that came out of the research that he was doing. So these are just different examples. My wife and I were talking the other day about, ticket scalping. It's like, why can't, you bought a ticket and you want to sell that ticket, you want to go to the venue and sell that ticket and maybe make a little money off that ticket. Well, why not? It's your property, right? So, where did that law come from? You can't sell a ticket. We call it scalping. That's kind of interesting, even language wise, right? And then these are just like thinking about individuals who are homeless. There's, ordinance, whether or not you can actually feed or provide food or other items for people who are homeless. I mean, these are laws, that start to reflect interest. If you're interested, this is about the broken windows policy, I believe. So this is stop and frisk. You can read more about that particular policy, where it came from and why it's problematic. And then we kind of get near the end, functionalism, the idea that if there's deviance exists in all groups, all societies, across all time. Now, what's deviant is going to be different. How many things are defined as deviant or criminal are different, but it exists in all places and all time. Therefore, it serves some vital functions. That through deviance, we can clarify the values in society. We can establish, to what extent, where are our moral boundaries, how much as we can accept of going outside of some moral positioning. Deviance brings people together to fight against the enemy. It creates an in-group, out-group kind of thing. And deviance can promote kind of social change. The limitation of this theory is it doesn't address issues of inequality and power very well. If we look at, protest, athletes protesting racial injustice going back to 1968 Olympic Games in Mexico City, or Kaepernick, 49ers, Black Lives Matter movement, our discussions about whether or not these things are deviant from a functionalist perspective is like these events help to bring our attention to social issues and engage us in a debate about particular social issues, in this case, about race relations in the United States. So that deviance forms a function of encouraging conversation and where's our boundary in terms of level of acceptance about racial injustice in society itself. These are just different examples. Immigration policies often kinds of go after this. We call it scapegoating theory, where immigrants are identified as being the problem of why we have crime or whatever. That's a long history and story. Politicians have been using that since the 1800s. I mean, it's nothing kind of new, but it's very functionalist in orientation, is that identifying that as deviant, especially during a time period of rapid social change where there's a lot of anomie. It's a way of bringing stability to the system itself. I won't go through these other examples. Maybe in class we can kind of talk about that, but think about House of Un-American Activities Committee, 1950s, the Red Scare of the 1950s. You can view that through the lens of the functionalist perspective. Okay, theme number 8, Merton's strain theory. So real quick, Merton's strain theory, this idea that every society has a cultural goal. Our cultural goal is the American dream. We have conventional means of getting there, or there are conventional means of getting to the cultural goal. Conventional means are such as work hard, go to vocational school, advance your education, get more training. These are the things you accept the goal of American dream. I'm trying to get, that piece of the American pie, and I'm going to do the conventional things to get there. Most people, regardless of their economic position, conform. Then you get these innovators, people who want to have the American dream, but they reject the means to get there. So individuals who engage in drug trafficking, for example, that's innovation. So Merton says, his perspective is that there's a tension, a strain that can go on. If the cultural goal is here, but the institutional means are far away, creates a lot of strain in a community that may result in certain types of deviant or criminal behavior. So he's looking at that larger level pattern that's going on, looking at it from that larger structural kind of issue. So then we get into things like, ritualism, people who reject the American dream, but accept the means. So they go to their job day in and day out, but not trying to get more and more of the American dream. Cultural goal of retreatism, so drug using subcultures, individuals who are homeless, is retreatism, giving up on the American dream as well as the means to get there. And he says that every once in a while there becomes, at a societal level, a social movement for change to actually change either the cultural goals or the means themselves. I think this is going on in the Pacific Northwest, where more youth are rejecting the American dream idea, or at least part of it, and saying, you know, I want to do something different with my life. I'm not going to chase the American dream like, you know, maybe my parents did or the previous generations. There's a reworking of what does that mean in terms of material wealth and possessions. Part of that has to do with like this, it's a way of decreasing the strain, right? Change expectations, change your goals. Don't follow the dominant cultural goal. So again, this is a macro level kind of issue. There's also class bias in this kind of perspective, that the American dream, that this assumption that everybody wants to have the American dream. Then theory doesn't address very well other kinds of deviance or criminal activity like embezzlement, prostitution, and things like that. Head Start, a program for pre-K kids, started for inner city kids in urban environments, and is basically a crime control measure that's related to emergent strain theory. It's providing more institutional means to be able to get to further and further in their education. How many more we got? We just got 2 more, I think. So Sutherland's differential association, basically that, so it's a social learning theory that all deviance behavior is learned like conventional behavior. We learned the process of learning is the same, but what we learn is different. So we learn in relationships with others. People learn techniques, motives, rationalizations for engaging in particular behavior. What people are learning are their definitions, whether it's favorable or unfavorable to commit a particular act. The more people become involved within another group that they differentially associated with, can shape their definitions of favorable versus unfavorable. Part of the degree of influence of that group is how much priority so how much credibility do I give that group, or how much weight do I give that group? Is that group important to me in terms of, you know, the way they view something? So the priority I give that group in my life and the intensity of which I'm involved in that group. So if I'm involved in that group every day, has a different level of intensity than not. Sutherland examined white collar crime, was his big area of crime that he examined, and he applied this. It's how he developed this differential association theory, but it's been applied to like drug using subcultures. Think about sexual assault on college campuses, within fraternities, classic differential association. You could apply that to there as well. And then finally, we kind of get to Hershey's social control theory, where Hershey's asking the question, not why do people commit deviance, but why not? So he's removing the moral position here that people who commit acts of deviance are morally inferior to those who do not, that those who, you know, are more conventional or are more just and more moral. He says, well, basically we all have the same capacities, but the issue is, what is our stake in conformity? Where are we at in terms of our position? How committed are we to conformity? And what are the consequences if we violated something? So for example, if we are more attached to conventional society, like my social relations are in conventional world, I have a belief in conventional society, and I have opportunities to get ahead in conventional society, I have a stake in conformity, or a person has a stake in conformity. So it's not that they're more moral than somebody else. It's that they have a stake in conforming itself. But that doesn't address everything. You get issues like, oh, here's Kraft, the owner of the Patriots, who was caught in soliciting services from prostitutes. And it's like, he's got everything, right? He's totally got, bonded to society. He's got belief opportunity and attachment to conventional world, but yet he's engaged in criminal or deviant behavior. So it doesn't explain everything, but it's a powerful vehicle to start to explain our connections and how our connections can be powerful instruments of helping to shape our decisions and shaping conformity. Looking here more closely at Central Oregon, a program called the COPY program, of having kids of incarcerated parents be with others who are in the conventional world, providing a more stable environment. And a lot of this is working off like Hershey's social control theories, making sure that individuals are bonded to the conventional world and have an opportunity in the conventional world, and they develop more of a stake in conformity. It's the relationships that people have that are the most powerful influences over our behavior. So focusing on informal social control for the most part. So Palaces for the People, a great book by Kleinenberg, looking at social infrastructure, the design of our communities, and how the design of community can facilitate degrees of involvement and engagement with us within the community itself. And that infrastructure is somewhat invisible to us, but it's really powerful. And it can be an impact on our individuals' abilities to be involved in the conventional world. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that as a class. Last couple of things here we're not going to talk about in bed, we'll talk about them in class, like master status, looking glass self, dramaturgy, social construction of reality. You can kind of see these get played out maybe in looking at deviance. And then if you want, I encourage you to look at this, the Norway designed the most humane prison. Really interesting to look at the Norwegian model of the prison system, and different from the United States and our system, and just cultural variability. Just like seeing that difference helps us realize there's different possibilities, and makes us wonder, how did they get to that place where they have this different kind of institution? Wow, that was a lot of information. We will be processing that in class for sure. Have yourself a great day, and see you in class.